Hello, I'm Bernard Picton. I'm going to talk you through this video which was shot on the wreck at the entrance to Strangford Lough, which is called Lee's Wreck. I'm a diver. I've been diving since 1970 when I learned to dive at Bristol University, and then in 1975 I moved to Northern Ireland to work for the Ulster Museum as a marine biologist. This wreck was originally an Italian-built ship, and then she was towed into Strangford Lough to be salvaged and sank just at the entrance to Strangford here, north of Portaferry. Here we're underwater, and you can see the divers, and in front of us here is a ballan wrasse which is swimming across. And the other small fish that you can see here are wrasse. They're gold cine wrasse. You can recognise them by this little black spot on their tail. It's shallow water here, so it's about 10 metres deep, and you can see there's some red seaweeds on the rocks. And the diver's got a torch because in Strangford Lough it's often quite dark. The visibility in this day was about 10 metres, but that's quite good for Strangford, and so we often need a torch to see what you're doing underwater. Here you can see the rock is made up of great big blocks, which are mostly actually broken off pieces of rock rather than solid bedrock, though there is some solid bedrock just here. And then the wreck, that's the underneath of the wreck that we can see just in front of us, so we can, sometimes there's a place just along here that you can see right under the wreck. And the wreck is covered with these white things, which are soft corals, dead man's fingers. Now we're looking down into slightly deeper water. You can see down there aren't any seaweeds really at all, just a few bits of red seaweed. While if we look round and up into the shallower water, you'll see that there is actually some kelp growing up there. These boulders make good places for things to hide, and lots of little fish and other things are living in amongst them. And here the divers found a tompot blenny poking its head out of a gap between the stones. The tompot blenny is quite a decent sized fish, probably about 9 inches long. And Jerry's come round so you've got a better angle of his head there. Here we're looking up in towards the shallower water, and you can see some kelp in the distance there. And in front of us here, cuckoo wrasse. This is a male cuckoo wrasse. Male cuckoo wrasse are blue and red, quite brightly coloured, and quite a decent sized fish, about 30-40 centimetres long. And then this is the female cuckoo wrasse. The female cuckoo wrasse is pink in colour with black and white spots along its back. And originally they thought it was a different sort of fish altogether, but it's just the female of that cuckoo wrasse. You can see there's quite a bit of current running. You can see the kelp in the background there with the current moving it around. And that makes this a very, very rich place for marine life. So there's a lot of things living on the seabed. This fish coming towards us here is a ling. Ling are quite large fish. This one would probably be about 1 metre long. And they're mostly nocturnal. They don't really come out into the open much in the daytime like this. You can see it's got a very big eye for seeing well in the dark, and then at the front of the head there you can see this thing sticking out that looks like a fish hook, which is a barbel. And these cod family fish, a lot of them have these barbels, and they help them tell whether what they're about to take a bite of is actually food. So you can probably taste with that barbel. There's a big spiny starfish on this rock, and then behind it, these fluffy things. There's some hydroid in the center of the picture there, and then these little sea anemones all around. And that spiny starfish is probably the biggest sort of starfish that we find. Here's the female cuckoo wrasse again. And then here you can see a few more red seaweeds, so we're going up into slightly shallower water here. Depth is a very significant thing underwater because as you go down into deeper water, the pressure changes very, very quickly. Water is so dense. So the other thing that happens though is that the light drops off very quickly. So as you go down into deeper water, these are rock cooks, and the rock cook is another sort of wrasse. They're quite territorial, so they tend to be always in this one sort of area. And then these round things that you keep seeing are sea urchins. There are several different sorts of sea urchins, but we only have one large one. So these are the common edible sea urchin, or they're called the edible sea urchin in Latin. So they're not usually eaten these days. This dead man's fingers here is closed up, but in a minute you'll see some that are very fluffy and open. They close up for several months during the year, which is when they're brooding larvae, and then they open up again. When we're underwater, we're breathing compressed air. So that tank on the back, a lot of people think it's oxygen, but it's not. It's compressed air stored in a tank and pumped up to 200 or 300 times atmospheric pressure. And that means that we've got enough stored in that tank just to breathe normally for about an hour underwater. Here you can notice perhaps that the current is slightly running through this weed. This is again all red seaweeds. So here we're up probably about 9-8 meters. And then this crab in the middle here is a velvet swimming crab. The velvet swimming crab is one of the most bold of the crabs, and you can see it's got these bright red eyes. And then those two little things in the front there, he's got, those are his jaws and little sensors for tasting the water. Again, looking for food. Here's the ballan wrasse again. Then the dead man's fingers here you can see are looking fluffy. That's because they've got the polyps out to feed. And if you look very closely at the dead man's fingers, you see that fluffiness on the outside is actually lots and lots of little polyps. Each of them have 8 tentacles, so they're called octocorals. And a lot of people then would call those soft corals because they're not hard like a coral that you'd get in tropical seas. Now this is a sea urchin down the middle of the picture here. And then you can see more clumps of hydroids. And the rock completely covered with dead man's fingers, which tells you that this is a place that the current runs very strongly, because those dead man's fingers are relying on catching particles of food out of the water. So they need a lot of water movement bringing food to them. So just, you might spot a starfish down the bottom left there. That was a Henrisia, which doesn't have a common name. Well, maybe some people call it a bloody Henry, but there are actually two sorts of these hydroids that are common here. So there's one that has just this individual stems aren't branched, and then another one where the stems are quite branched. They're both called Nematisia is their Latin name. That's the second species there. Again, a little gold cineras hiding under the rock. And a couple of sea urchins there. That's just the common sea urchin. We do have other sorts of sea urchins, but the others in our waters are all very small. That sea urchin's quite large. And then on the rock here you can see, just went out of the picture to the left, a common starfish. And here there are a lot of small wrasse darting in and out of the boulders. I should tell you a bit about the history of why this wreck ended up here. After the war, it was a liberty ship that was built during the war, and then after the war it was being brought in to be salvaged. And there's a bit of a rock that sticks up in this part of Strangford Lough, and as they were trying to get it in towards the shore to salvage it, it got stuck on this rock, and then it broke in half and sank, so it got stuck here. But it's actually one of the best dives and one of the best habitats that we have. It's in this strong current at the entrance to Strangford Lough, so the wreck itself now is completely coated with hydroids, sea anemones, sponges, and it forms a fantastic habitat because of being in this place where the current can run very strongly. So as Strangford's filling up, the current swirls all around the wreck and brings food to all these animals that are living attached to the seabed and attached to the wreck. And as the current, when the tide turns and the current goes out again, now this is the rudder, and this was where the propeller would have been at the back of the ship. So you see there's a rope here that's sort of got tied in underneath the wreck there. No idea why. But this is the big hole between the rudder and the stern of the ship where the propeller would have been, and you can go through that gap and through to the other side. And here you can see that the seabed's covered, the yellow sponge to the left there, covered in hydroids, sea anemones, dead man's fingers, soft corals. Here again we can see the actual rudder there. So the rudder is still in place, but the propeller isn't. We're looking up at the surface, you can just see the surface there. So here we're in about 10 metres of water, and the fact that you can see right up to the surface means that the visibility must be about 10 metres or so today. That's quite good for this dive. There's the depth gauge at the top there showing us we're in about 10 metres, and we're also showing there that we're nearly out of compressed air. So we're going to go back to the surface.